Yes.
Let's see.
Powered on.
Get it.
There we go.
There we go. Okay. Does that constitute a flash? Yes. Okay. Planning Commission of the City of Wilsonville, Wednesday, April 10th, 2019 is now in session. I ask our clerk to call the roll.
Commissioner Jerry Gordon, or Greenfield, I'm sorry.
Here?
Eric Postma,
Here.
Ron Heberly,
Here.
Peter Hurley,
Here.
Cameron Mesbach,
Here.
Phyllis Millen, Simon Springle,
Here.
I ask us to rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This is a time that citizens have the opportunity to address the Planning Commission regarding any item that is not already scheduled for a formal public hearing tonight, and there is none. Therefore, if any member of the audience would like to speak about any work session item or any other matter of concern, please raise your hand so that we may hear from you now, and I see none. Minutes of the March 13th meeting have been distributed. Does anyone have any additions or corrections to suggest? Hearing none, the minutes are accepted as submitted. And we move on immediately to our business of the night, which is a work session on residential code revision project. And I'll ask our planning director, Miranda Bachel, to introduce our presenter.
Great, thank you, Chair Greenfield. Dan Polly, Senior Planner with the city, is going to present this evening on a residential code revision project. This project has some history that we've been working on for some time that has pointed out some inconsistencies that are within our code and that we feel might be worth addressing. And Dan's going to outline all of those for you tonight, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion about those and get your input.
Yes, and look forward to it. Thank you all for being here tonight. So there's a lot to this project. As Miranda said, it has some history. Seen a few planners come and go working on it. But I mean, the last kind of overall code rework was in 99 and 2000. And so, and then also in 2005, there were some substantial changes around open space, what can be counted as open space. But outside of that, for the planned development residential zones, and there's the tweaks, of course, to the accessory dwelling units and a couple of tweaks we did along with that back last year. But besides that, not much has changed. And so we've had a lot of years of experience working with developers in the community to kind of see what's working, what's not working. And certainly some things, as some of you recall from your days on the DRB, there are some things that don't work great and could use some additional clarity. So in this and subsequent work sessions, and then follow up with public hearings eventually, we hope to get some of those resolved and provide better clarity and better expectations and better design in the end, better communities for development partners and the community as a whole. So with that, I just want to talk a little bit about what I would propose as kind of a scope of what we're going to accomplish tonight, because there's so many holes we could go down and get into details. So the goal tonight is to introduce it and and we may get into a few details, but not that many. And so a lot of stuff I may respond with your permission to defer to our future work sessions. But I hope, particularly as we discuss some of the basic concepts, to get your feedback on those. So with that, let's go ahead and move into it. Really, tonight, I want to cover the basic project concepts, which will be a larger chunk of the hour we have together, and then hit on some of the topics or discussion points or issues that we come across and some draft recommendations that have come from staff looking at this. And really, as you look at these, you can divide it into two broad topic areas. That's density calculations, how we calculate density, and a lot of that also relates to lot size. There's definitely a nexus there. And then the open space requirements. Overall, really what we're talking about here is, I like to call them, a term I've used as land consuming requirements. So there's certain requirements in the residential code that take square footage to meet. And you need to make sure that they work together, because you can't have the same square footage meeting competing code in most circumstances. So that is what we're going to look at. So let's get into the basic concepts. And again, as you know, you've all seen this PowerPoint, obviously, and so I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to regurgitate it all. I'll hit on a couple high points from the slide to get the conversation going, and then I really want to spend most of the time getting your feedback on it and your guidance on it. So first of all, the basic project concepts, I will read these because pretty brief anyway. There's, first of all, how we get to comprehensive plan density. When we determine how many units can be built on a given property, we rely on the comprehensive plan density. Also, the minimum density equals 80% of the maximum density. We're keeping the allowed uses in terms of multifamily, single family, duplexes, ADUs, the same as in existing code, and not changing the actual numbering on any of the plan, either the plan map or the zone map designations. Though, as we'll talk about, there are some gaps and some kind of interesting, to make a solid continuum, need to fill some gaps. So are looking at adding some new plan designations and zone map designations to fill those gaps, which could potentially be used in the future. Better coordination of lot sizes and the densities. And I know many of you worked on waivers at DRB, and many of you had some strong comments on waivers at DRB over the years. And so really looking at a way when we come into these conflicting criteria to have some predictable flexibility rather than just the broad, unguided waiver process. And also, when we come to open space, really emphasizing quality over quantity, and also having lot standards based on the size rather than the zoning is really what found in the research briefly on that one is, with the way that master plans and density averaging works, you'll have lot sizes that are essentially the same size in a variety of zones, which have different standards. And it makes sense to have all those lots that are essentially the same lot, same product type on them to have similar standards across the city. So those are the initial kind of basic project concepts. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on those.
Who wants to go first? Well, I'll leap in with
Thank you.
a fairly, perhaps small, an obvious one, quality over quantity. How does that square with the notion of clear and objective?
It actually gets more clear and objective than it currently does, and we'll get into that. Is really, it comes down to who you're having design it. So some specific requirements that, you have the appropriately credentialed professionals designing an open space rather than a developer saying, oh, I guess I can put some sod in a park bench here and call it an open space. So that's really where it's not a list of, it must have this, but it has requiring a quality design, the right professional to design it with some guidance in terms of gearing it as similar language as we have in Villebois, of having making sure you're using concepts in the landscape architecture field about, gearing it to different age groups and abilities and user groups, really maximize the space.
As having at one time supervised a program that produced those qualified professionals, I certainly support that idea. Is there anything in our current code or development system that calls for this?
There is, when you get into the plan development standards, there's specific requirements that you have, like a credentialed planner, credentialed engineer, but there's not as clear language when you come down to designing, quote, usable open space, which isn't otherwise defined.
Who pays for this professional?
The developer pays for these
Is
professionals.
likely to be any pushback on that?
Typically, they have these sort of professionals. Obviously, developers want to reduce costs, but they have a team of professionals working on this anyway. Oftentimes, they even have landscape architects already on board. So I don't suspect a lot, because it's just adding someone to the design team, someone focused on this, which is an important part of a community that you're designing. So it seems appropriate to have someone kind of appropriately credentialed designing the kind of the center of your community or your neighborhood. And we'll get into that one more later as well.
Do we see a lot of variation in lot standards based upon different zones, or is that kind of or is it the variation seen in places like Villebois or Frog Pond or?
And this comment's mainly focused on the PDR zones.
Okay.
So you'll take a lot in, let's say, Courtside Estates, Wilsonville Meadows, and Park at Murrayfield that may be the same size.
Okay.
Right? But they're all different zones. One's PDR 4, I believe, one's PDR 3, and one's PDR 2, which if you look at the code as it is today, have vastly different, excuse me, lot coverage requirements and such. For some of them have been granted waivers and such over time, but if you read the code straight now, the criteria are vastly different for a same size of lot.
Have we had much feedback on whether that's an issue? And I ask that because I think it does create like slightly different character in some of those neighborhoods, which maybe we want to retain. I don't, or do we really want to tinker with something that's perhaps works and give us a variety or variation?
Well, most of
know.
these neighborhoods with the plan development process have the lot coverage established in the plan development approval. So it's a question of, these changes over time or new land in those same sort of standards, same sort of scenario, approaching it differently in a kind of a more reasonable way that you're going to have same lot coverage for the same size of lot. And also, it actually makes the code function a lot better too. You're able to put everything in one table rather than have it scattered in text throughout the code.
For your first and your last bullet points, can you flesh out for me what you're generally looking at there? So when you're talking about fill gaps in the first one, what your thinking is, and then also continuing on with what you were just talking about, size rather, on lot size rather than zoning. Help me understand what you're thinking.
Yeah, and I think I have a slide later, a table that will lay that out a lot more. So if we can defer that maybe for a few minutes. And if there's any of these ideas that pop out to you as, okay, do these make sense? Is staff headed the wrong direction? I mean, these are really based on the ground knowledge, working with the DRB and the development community and neighbors over a number of years. And just want to, truth test with the commission if these make sense, if we're headed in the right direction. It's kind of, these are some guiding ideas and principles as we look at the details of the code changes.
So along the lines of, I'm interested to see your table as well. Along the lines of filling gaps, do we have any concept of something in between multi-family and single-family? Something middle housing, fourplexes, that sort of stuff. Is there any zoning that in which we could build housing along those lines?
So as it stands today, especially when we're talking about the planned development residential zones, the different PDR zones, they allow the whole array. They allow single family to attached to row houses, duplexes, to multifamily. So each of the PDR zones allow that. So it's a question of really, this is a question, an exercise of density rather than product type. All the product types are currently allowed in all these zones, and there's no proposed change to that.
So the reason we don't have housing like that is because of the density requirements, or what?
No, I think it's more marketplace over time and just kind of what land was available or what was, I mean, a lot of these neighborhoods were developed in the 80s and 90s where the market was really, was the garden apartments and the single family, and that's what was built. But there's nothing in that time. I mean, certainly even back in Charbonneau, you see there's a lot of attached product there. And I mean, throughout Wilsonville's history, we've actually, more than other communities, allowed a variety of housing types. And all the reasons they haven't been built, I mean, and they have been built to one extent or the other. You see condos and some row houses, but a limited amount. So, I mean, certainly I think in our equitable housing study, that's something that fleshing out still, where our code allows it, why is it not happening, or what may be appropriate to change the extent that it's built.
Okay.
Particularly in the PDR zones. Again, this doesn't necessarily cover the village zone or the residential neighborhood zone, which is being applied in Frog Pond.
Okay.
The issue that Chair brought up, the tension between quality and quantity. Over the year and a half or so that I've been on the commission, I keep pushing on getting away from that dichotomy and looking more at function or performance standards. To me, quality is not versus quantity. Then the two need to go together.
Yeah.
And that's where the function, whether it's working or not, and the performance standards that go with it need to be outlined. The same applies to, frankly, the density or the size of lot and all those things. A lot of the complaints that I hear is people trying to fit themselves functionally in a space that doesn't function for them. Now, we can say, well, that's all they can afford, so the market forces are forcing them into that. That could be true. But I'm also seeing potentially that we are creating an infrastructure and forcing people to adapt to it when they're not really thinking about the performance standards that infrastructure can support. Sure. And so they end up using the garage for storage instead of for a car, and that becomes an issue. So those to me are functional elements of a space that aren't being looked at when we issue waivers. Or look at lot size, frankly, or density, or open space functioning. So I'm hoping that in this kind of, as we go down these rabbit holes, that we are paying attention to performance standards that we're looking for spaces and infrastructure that works properly for the intended use. And that we can be overt about that, at least, to the buyer. And to the community that's supporting or not supporting some development.
I appreciate that, those comments. One thought, first of all, on the open space, a little later on, and then particularly in subsequent work sessions, we'll get into those details. I do think where we're headed is more of a performance based when it comes to open space. The quality really comes into play more when you're talking about a smaller project where the current standards is the same, for example, for a 5-lot subdivision and a 49-lot subdivision. You require the same amount of open space, but scaling that more for those smaller subdivisions, and in those scenarios, having more of a performance-based quality rather than, try to fit in this random open space wherever you can squeeze it in, focus on having a cohesive open space. And I think I'll be interested in your thoughts on that as we get into more of those details. In terms of parking in particular, and certainly I think that's obviously an important issue as we look at narrower lots and such. Outside of this, another project that we're just kicking off is looking at some parking standards, including in residential. And I'll be interested to bring that to this group as well and have that conversation. So we're not really getting into the parking nitty-gritty, but I do think it's important to kind of keep in mind that interrelatedness as we look at these standards. Other thoughts on this, and probably only a couple more minutes on this, and we'll get into some of the other, some of the specific topic areas.
We'll have it would be appropriate a little later to revisit the quality-quantity issue when we get into
Certainly,
the
yeah.
nitty-gritty. Okay.
Yep. Anything else before we move on? Okay. So getting into the density calculation and lot sizes, this topic area 1. As you'll see, some of this will be multiple slides where I present the details and draft recommendation. Others will be a single slide, such as this one where it's fairly straightforward. There's this disconnect between the comp plan text and the map in terms of the highest density range. And so simply correcting that to be consistent with that 80% of max notion is all that's proposed there. Any thoughts on that?
I guess, Dan, my question is, where did the discrepancy originate at? Was there an intent of one versus the other, and it was just missed when the comp plan was created or updated?
That is as much as I understand. I've read through this record quite a bit. I don't see anywhere where that was intentional.
Okay.
And on one hand, it does make sense that it was a volume of work being done at that point where details could have been missed, because it was a complete redo of a lot of the comp plan and the zoning standards. So something like that could easily be missed on a process like that. So as far, if someone listening on TV has a recollection of 1999, and if there was some purpose, I'm not aware of it from my review of the record or talking to folks, so.
Okay. So there were separate processes and different individuals involved.
Well, it was just a big volume of work that the Planning Commission was doing, so they weren't necessarily able to give a huge amount of attention to every detail. The next one is really this conversion. As our code work, we talk about our 2-map system, as you know, where we have our comprehensive plan map that has designations on it, and then we have our zoning map. And that they're related, and they're supposed to be related to each other, but the conversions are listed in both places, but they're not consistent. So this is really where I put this table in to kind of show where those inconsistencies are. I'll talk more about lot size and consistencies later, but here, particularly in that middle to high range, you see where it's talking about, it can be either or, but then it gives this more flexibility in either or in the comp plan, but then it just lists it in the development code and doesn't explain why. And so really fleshing that out and understanding that more is something that we're trying to do. And also making it where it makes sense and where it relates to the lot sizes that are typically built in a given zone. So one easy way to fix code when you have two codes that, or two sets of language that don't disagree, is get rid of one of them. So that's removing the PDR zone references in the comp plan. I don't think it takes anything away from the comp plan, and then providing that table in the zoning code that really clarifies how you implement the comp plan in the, with the zoning. And so then you have the conversion table, which again, I'll bring that up. I'm going to talk about a couple more things, and I'll bring up all this information on a single table. So I think it'll be more useful as we get into that table for comment. So one thing is the next one is really how we calculate the number of units. It's not clear if it's gross or net in our code. In practice, we've been doing gross, and we intend to do that, so just making that clear. And also, really, one of the biggest issues in this whole project, and really a center of this, is that when you start looking at the average lot size and minimum density at build-out requirements in the development code, you can't get to the density that the zoning code, that the code's supposed to get to. That just those lot sizes don't, and the actual requirements don't correlate. So real quick, I'm going to get out of here and I'll just show this real briefly. We'll get into a lot more details here. I have lots of spreadsheets to share with you eventually, so yeah, much to look forward to. But just in this highlighted one here, you see, for example, PDR2 based on like a typical 10-acre site, you know, the minimum lot size and the lot size you need to get the number of units in the comp plan, you know, you're having 8,000 square foot versus 12,000 square foot. So there's a disconnect there that if you have a 10-acre site, you really can't build lots that size and still have your streets and open space. And so there's some variance there. And so adjusting that to making that clear is really one of the key things that you'll see proposed in this table that I'll be showing you here in a moment.
Dan, is any of that discrepancy driven by changes in requirements for street widths or anything like that that is eating away at available land?
You know, certainly, not necessarily, not that I've seen that has a big impact. Certainly, something to keep in mind is stormwater requirements. LIDA requirements takes up land now, and we deal with that in land and planning strips and out of planning strips. But generally, we've allowed that to be used as non-usable to meet part of the 25% open space since it's landscape. So that is actually, they're able to count that as landscaping. The biggest as I've done the research, the biggest area where this really came up is that 2005 code change, where prior to 2005, for example, like at Renaissance at Canyon Creek, kind of in that early 2000s, backyards were allowed to be counted as open space. And so that changed in 2005. But when they changed that in 2005, I don't see evidence that those other land consuming requirements were ever changed. So now you require non-backyard open space with the same size of lots, that the math starts to not work.
So we're doing that now.
What's that?
We're doing that now, getting out our calculators.
Yeah, so yeah, we'll look at those calculations, and I'm happy to explain those in detail to you in due time. It's fun math. And you know what? I totally left my presentation, so let me get back to it. And go to the slide we were on. Right here. Go from current. Okay, so really is, first of all, adding language. What we're, draft recommendations there is to add language to clarify how it's calculated, and then removing those conflicting lot sizes, and really in the end creating this table that has all that information that correlates across it. And then I've talked a little about this, but and then again, those land consuming requirements. I've mentioned that. And again, it's really getting everything into that table and also creating this adjustment process. So particularly when you get a smaller lot with SROZ on it, you start to get constrained it's a situation where you start to get constrained on the land. And so some of these land consuming requirements start to conflict. And so I think it's helpful then to have a clear process of how we're going to remove those conflicts. So adjustment process would allow, for example, kind of the draft would be to read up to a 20% reduction in lot size in order to get those number of lots. And then once you maximize that adjustment, then you can start adjusting down your open space as well in order to meet the comp plan required density. So we'll in due time get into more how that works. So this is the table. And let me kind of explain what you see here. So first is the zoning designations, with the draft names of the new zoning designations that could be used in the future in yellow there. I've seen versions with this like PDR 1.75 or something, and I'm like, no. So my proposal is use some letters. So you'd have VLD would be very low density, LD would be low density, MD is medium density, MHD is medium high density, then HD is high density. And then you have, in the next column, you have the density range district. This is significant, and it uses this language in the comp plan. But something, as you start to try to make all this work, is really hard to keep with whole numbers, especially when you're trying to satisfy that 80% of the maximum, the minimum being 80% of the maximum. So really what that density range district represents is the nearest whole number. And then the actual allowed density is reflected then in the decimals with max density per acre and then the minimum density per acre. Just because, especially when you're with those lower numbers, you're going to tend to have, there's no way you're going to get 80% of 6 to be a whole number. And so the idea would be provides that clarity, answers questions. Then in the last two columns, you see in the yellow would be the proposed minimum lot size, and then the typical lot size, which represents 90%, a density of 90% of the maximum. And then in the parentheses next to it is what the lot size in the current PDR zone is. So you can see like for the lower densities for PDR 1 and 2, for PDR 1, there's not much change, but then there becomes a bigger disconnect in PDR 2. So those actually go down quite a bit, 8 to 10,000, which is, matter of fact, the size of lots you tend to see in the PDR 2 zone that were approved through the waiver process. You don't see a huge change in PDR 3, a bit lower in PDR 4. And then actually, somewhat lower in PDR 5 and such as well. And then really able to, what you also see here is those new zoning districts providing an opportunity for some of those common lot sizes that weren't really facilitated that aren't really facilitated in the current zoning because of the density requirements and how they relate to lot size. I will also comment that this shows lot size, but this still facilitates the development of multifamily or other housing types on larger lots as well. But this is assuming a 10-acre single-family residential neighborhood. So give you a minute to look over this and happy to answer questions.
So Dan, can you help explain why is it that it wouldn't be simpler to just revise PDR1 to encompass a 1.5 maximum density per acre instead of and the same thing for 2, 3, 4, and 5, instead of creating a separate zone in the middle of the existing zones?
It really is guided by that principle that keeping the current things the same. Where you're not really changing, particularly for, you see PDR, that three units per acre, that 1 unit per acre, you're not upping the amount of units allowed on that per se. So it's really trying to keep it consistent with the current designations. And particularly when you get in those low numbers, I mean, you're dealing with such small numbers that taking 80% of a small number, I mean, again, it's hard to get to a whole number there. But I will say, as we've looked at different, myself and other predecessors have looked at various renditions of this over time, it's been a pretty consistent thing that it would benefit from having these interim zones as an option. I mean, honestly, I don't know how much they'd be used, but it provides a clear continuum to allow flexibility both for decision makers and for developers over time.
But if we're not sure it would be used, I guess then my question would be, why would we do it?
Because we have these questions, we come into these issues, and it could be used, and we're trying to anticipate potential issues. And particularly when we're trying to get for example, a 7,000 square foot lot size is really hard to get it under a PDR 2 or 3 that exists today. And so maybe there is an area in the future or a rezoning area inside the city where we desire that.
But
and
if
it's
you
not
updated
enabled currently.
If you updated PDR 2 to a 6,400 square foot minimum lot size, you would then allow that lot size to occur in that area.
But then it relates to you'd have to have other larger lot sizes to not exceed the minimum density or the maximum density for that zone. Good question, Ron, and certainly we can give it some more thought, but I know this has been a pretty consistent thing as we've looked at this over the years of having these intermediate zones. But it's a valid question whether or not they'd be used. But to make the math cleanest possible, it's what makes sense. But, the other option would be to just, assume that no one's ever going to build within those ranges, that you're either going to go, you're not going to build a lot or have any subdivision that has an average density between an average lot size anywhere between 10 and 24,000.
I think I'm coming into this a little cold, and it's not good when lawyers just speak off the top of their head, right? So we like to do our research, and I have not researched this, but I can also imagine that in particular, if we are essentially rezoning current zones, that would trigger a Measure 56 notice potentially to every property owner in one of these PDR zones. So I could see that a reason to create new zones is that you're not changing the current zones and thus triggering that for all current property owners.
And I
But
think we're gonna
I
do
haven't
it.
researched that question, so that's just something I'm thinking of off the top of my head.
Sure, and I think we're going to end up doing a Measure 56 notice for all this in the end anyway. But it does get to that point of Measure 49, is it, right? So where you're not actually changing any existing property. And we've used this sort of process. I think one example is in Old Town, where we anticipated future changes and some potential future needs, and we facilitated it and kind of enabled it to happen, which can be a wise thing to do. But at the same time, we didn't change anything at that point. That is really then property owner driven with consent of DRB and council to make any of those changes down the road.
We're really only talking about future permitting.
Correct. I do see a potential that maybe there's a parcel, let's say a small 2-acre parcel somewhere in town where, that's currently zoned PDR3 and someone may not be able to just make it work. So they could propose, can we change it? It's, meets all the same criteria and code. Can we change it? Can we change the density to, let's say, 5 to 6 units an acre? And this is the benefit of it, and get council's buy-off on that. So that's potential. Because at the same time, I know particularly in Frog Pond, we don't anticipate necessarily applying the PDR zones out there. Most likely we'll do the residential neighborhood zone or something similar to it. So it is accurate to say there is not a lot of applicability known for these changes, besides changing really in terms of adding these new zones. Besides, I'll make a comment here in a minute, but the biggest thing is making sure that the actual lot sizes reflect what's historically been built and what's able to be built in that zone. We do get comments and from staff and applicants. The same is they like the clean math of having a continuum that fills in the gaps. I don't think it hurts having those, but it's true that there's not a huge amount of applicability at this point if we're not necessarily applying it to future zones. But it gives people options if they do want to change something. So I'd be interested in what the whole commission thinks if this exercise of adding the new zones is worth it or not.
So my thought is that filling in the gaps makes sense for the reason you've said, and we don't really want to be changing the existing zones. I get all that. What seems to offend me, and it's only the mathematical sensibilities, is mixing up your numbers and names in your new zones. Now we have 12 zones, 7 of which have numbers and 5 of which have names, and that's really not workable.
Yeah, it's really hard to work around when you don't want to use decimal points. I mean, we could do 1.5, 2.5 and such.
Two options, yeah. One is you use decimal points and say, PDR 1.5. Or the other option is you renumber them all, which I don't know how that would affect. You'd have to say you landowners in Meadows, you thought you were PDR 3, but actually now you're going to be PDR 4 to 5, for example. And I might be incorrect about Meadows, so please don't
PDR,
bombard me with hate mail if you're listening to this.
I will have to agree with Commissioner Springall. It does very much bother my, my specific nature to have letters and numbers intermixed in that style. If you were going to go about renaming all the PDRs, then I would also hazard the question of why you wouldn't just change the lot requirements and then just still remain with 7 PDRs. So
How about PDR, VLDA, and VLDB?
So what I was, I don't know, I may not have explained this, but what I was thinking was if renaming the zones is an option, then you can rename them after the range. So you could have PDR 0 to 1, PDR 1 to 2, PDR 2 to 3, PDR 3 to 4 down, where each zoning designation relates to the density
I like that idea.
range.
So yeah, I've struggled with that one, so I'm open to ideas. So I can, I've never loved those letters either, but it was an option that made more sense than decimal points in my mind at that point. So it's a good thought. I'll work around that. Anything else on this? I certainly will be spending more time with this table, and but some kind of broad direction or ideas would be appreciated at this point.
I'm sure you're already thinking this direction, but for the sake of, at least for me, when we get to the point where we're really digging into this, can we have some examples and see what it looks like, neighborhoods that it's talking about? Because it's tough to visualize these numbers into what that means for neighborhood character. I'm sure you're doing that, going to do that, but.
Yeah, for this and for the ADU project with the lot coverage, I've run statistics on every neighborhood, lot size, every which way throughout the city. So
you know it, great.
so happy to share those with you.
That'll be great, thanks.
And one final thought. As you well know, it's been multiple decades since I did anything like this at work. But given how the state and Metro, which we're both within, and then the largest neighbor to our north, I am very surprised that there isn't basically a statewide standard in terms of a format, not necessarily what the specific numbers end up being for each community. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And instead of trying to recreate or reinvent the wheel, what does our county, Clackamas, do? What does the large place north of us do? What does Metro do as a template? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and we're already,
If we can't steal from those and keep it simpler.
they're more complex than us, so where really there's actually a beauty to our zoning code that we actually have all the residential uses in one zone rather than when we try to plug our zoning into the state or metro tables, it gets difficult because we don't have exclusive single-family and exclusive multifamily zones like most jurisdictions. So that's kind of the way that most jurisdictions go. So we're actually quite a bit different in that sense. So it's difficult to do it because we've been built as planned developments.
What about then even outside the state? Again, not trying to reinvent the wheel. If somebody's they've already hashed it out instead of us sitting here beating our heads for the next 6 months on trying to figure it out.
Certainly, and there are things, particularly in the residential neighborhood zone, and that are playing into this is that the process we went through to come up with the residential neighborhood zone, and that's why we're primarily going to be using that in Frog Pond, is that we took the best of what we learned from Vilboa, from the PDR zones, and also from model codes that our consultants researched and had of how to best bring the best of all of those into a zoning standard. And so, in a sense, I haven't really mentioned this yet, in a sense, part of this project is really pulling some of those best things from the residential neighborhood zone that we found into the PDR zone. I think you'll see that particularly in maybe the open space concepts and how that's approached, so. But at the same time, we have to work with what we have today without changing too much, because there's legal ramifications if you change things too much, and plus confusion and such.
Are you saying we have to do this work because we're so much better than the other people around us? Is that really the answer to Commissioner Early?
Wilsonville's unique, and we're trying to even be better, so.
So Dan, I just wanted to clarify something that you said real quick. It sounded like you had said that these filler zones were responses to, I guess, the reality of what people have been trying to build and what people have been getting waivers for. Is that,
Yeah.
did I interpret that correctly?
And there are lots on the ground that exist in Wilsonville that are within those areas that aren't really enabled. They are really only enabled through waiver processes today.
Sure. And so, and I may be a little slow, then why is it that we wouldn't just want to revise PDR 1 to allow a 6,000 square foot lot as a minimum?
Because of that relationship to density.
Okay, I'm gonna have to see the spreadsheet to understand it.
That 80% rule really drives a lot of this, that once you put a number, so you can't have a range in a zone 0 to 4 because of that 80% rule.
Have a floor and a ceiling with your range, so.
Because once you put that upper number, your lower floor can only be 80% of that number. It can't be 20% of that number.
Okay,
So that in itself complicates this quite a bit.
I need your spreadsheet. That'll help.
Hopefully it helps.
Better not have numbers and letters mixed.
I don't use a lot of letters in the spreadsheet, don't worry. Okay, so if it's all right, let's park that. And, feel free to email me and send me other comments and as we continue to work through this. But want to get you to the housing report in a timely manner and not use more than our hour, pretty close to our hour allotted. So let's get into the open space requirements. I'll go through this pretty briefly, knowing that you've looked at this, and then we can just talk about it. We've already started talking about some of it. Again, that gross versus net issue and clarifying that it's gross. This is still a conversation that's out there and interested in your input, probably more than density. I can see an argument for doing net in terms of open space, but gross just makes the process a whole lot easier. You're able to know what it is from the beginning and design around it. Because sometimes as net changes, then you have to start changing things. Net is more flexible through a development proposal. So you have a stage 1 area, you have 25% open space, that number's known and set from the beginning, and it makes the process, I think, a lot cleaner. So that's, and a lot more clear for everyone involved. So that is why my recommendation right now is to go with gross area. That does end up being more, of course, than net, but as you're planning a whole area, especially when we start looking at these adjustments that we can do, I think it works cleaner than the alternative.
Can you clarify, please?
Sorry, can you clarify, please, what's the distinction between gross and net?
Gross is essentially the entire length. Thank you for that question. Gross is the entire acreage. Net is defined as typically the takeout of streets, sometimes takeout of other areas, common areas. So it's essentially the area that's just lots or alleys.
Do we end up, depending upon which way we go, do we end up with a troubling discrepancy. And the reason I ask that question is because if we've been, by precedent, we've been following a gross standard, right? I mean, typically.
Yes.
And so if we were to shift to a net, does it end up with a big enough discrepancy that we start to be taking things away from people with current empty lots, or
I think it's,
maybe that's a question for council to be thinking about, but
well, I think it, and also it comes down to when you get to that size, when these smaller vacant lots, for example, you're going to end up with these adjustments, so you end up with kind of a different number anyway.
I think that's why I asked, right? I was just wondering practically, how does that math work out? Does it create that problem or not? Every time we start talking
I
about
mean,
gross and net, it always seems to work backwards to
We
me.
should keep our eyes out for that, but I'm not aware of that being a big issue at
Okay.
this point.
Okay.
On gross versus net, so gross, we end up getting more open space. Net, because of the calculations, unless you change the percentage requirements, you would get less open space,
Correct.
which would technically mean that the developer could put more homes in as long as they were meeting the PDR requirements.
Yeah, so if you go net, then that would adjust potentially the lot size that could be allowed. Again, this is where it gets cleaner because if you're doing 10 acres, right, you know what 25% of 10 acres is if you go gross, but you don't necessarily know what it's going to be if you go net. Because you don't know exactly, is there a collector going through the middle of it? How wide? Is it going to have bike lanes? And is it going to be a local street? Is it going to be parking, no parking? And that all gets into those numbers. So you really, the math gets even more fun than it is now.
Right, but it does drive some of our affordability challenges if we're specifying more open space, which means you can have less development, which means the infrastructure that has to be put in is distributed under a smaller number of homes being developed.
It's not necessarily a smaller number of homes because the density requirement is the same regardless of if it's gross or net. Ends up really what it drives is those other land consuming requirements. The primary one being is lot size and what the minimum lot size is. So, if you go net, you're able to have a slightly higher minimum lot size because you have more area available for lots.
Okay.
Now I get what you mean by it's kind of backwards.
Yeah, that's why I say, thank you for reminding me why it's backwards. I can never remember why it's backwards, but it's backwards, and I think you just described it there. It's that, oddly enough, in the net, you end up with slightly larger lot size, individual lot sizes, correct?
Correct, because you're taking less land out for open space.
Yeah. Right.
Which is backwards in a different way, in that the number of DUs that you have should be driving the amount of open space that you need. So this is working against that. But that presumes that your 25% is based on some function or performance standard for open space.
Yeah.
I think that's probably not, that assumption will not hold. Am I correct in assuming that? 25 is just something that was agreed upon, right? You didn't
It's what the code says today, and we're not, and so at this point, we haven't looked at changing that.
But where did it come from?
It came from, I can research more exactly where that originated. I know it's been that way since the 2000s. I know it's 15% commercial industrial, 25% residential has been the standard throughout the city for a number of years. The origins of that, I don't have entirely clear,
So it is based on a wide, citywide kind of percentage of land allocation, is what I'm hearing,
yeah.
as opposed to some standard like every dwelling unit should be within a quarter mile of an open space.
Correct. And however.
So it's random in many ways.
Currently, the waiver process does allow for waivers of open space if you can show that you're within a certain distance from a public park or something like that. So yeah, there's much more discussion here, but in the interest of time, let me just, because you have that overall open space, which has always been a percentage, but then when you get into well, first of all, you get into the usable open space requirement, which is more a lot related to the number of lots. It's a tiered approach so for, 4 to 49 lots, you have quarter acre. For 50 to 99 lots, you have half an acre. And so, so when you are working on the margins there, there's some inconsistency, especially if you revise your subdivision in the end to get one less lot or one more lot, you end up with this vastly different requirement. So in that sense, and kind of consistent with what's in the residential neighborhood zone, is going with a 10% usable requirement. So it's more scalable based on the size of the project. But at the same time, if you have a small project, I mean, there is at some point a size that is a minimum to be functional. So if you have more than 10 units, that would be 2,000 square feet. If you're actually down 10 or less units, that may be as small as 1,000 square feet. So really getting language that gets at that percentage and scalable based on the size of the project more than it is today.
But that is only meant to be for small projects. It's scalable for small projects, not for all projects.
No, so any open space, even in a large, let's say you have a 10, 20 acre project, the 10% would be 10% of that project needs to be usable. So you could use 15% of that 15% difference could be, rainwater swells or preserve natural areas, other things that aren't necessarily usable, but 10% of that needs to be programmed usable park space.
Active versus passive, in other words.
Active. It could be passive, but I mean, a passive trail or something, but I guess that's active to some extent as well. Usable. And even in that, you couldn't have a small little tiny pocket park. It needs to be, 2,000 is fairly small, but it need to be at least 2,000 square feet each space. And kind of talked about this, as you've seen before, about usable. And this is where really having that requirement to have it designed by a registered landscape architect. This is consistent with some other requirements we have for, having a professional engineer and a professional planner on board on your design team. And also some specific language to require the design to maximize the age groups and other user groups served. So put a burden on the applicant to really show that they're designing this to maximize the groups that can be served by this space.
In topic 2.3, we are implying that tiered requirement is not a good thing. Is that because it's tiered, or is there some other reason why a tiered open space requirement isn't good?
There's some simplicity to it. The tiered now is just such a broad range that, again,
so it's the
you
size
have
of the tier that matters?
the size of the tier is really is the primary issue. But then if you get down to little tiny tiers, then it gets just really cumbersome.
Because then on in 2.4, you're talking about minimum 2,000 square feet, except in developments less than 10 units, and then it's 1,000. That's a tiering.
Yeah, that's a basic tiering. But, so, yeah, there is still in that sense a tiering aspect. So tiering in itself is not bad. It's just, it doesn't really treat different sizes of development as written today. It doesn't treat different sizes of development consistently. And also to get into kind of a tier that would do that, it gets, then you end up with 30 tiers and it gets
a
quite
percentage
complex.
formula doesn't work?
Well, that's why we're going to a percentage formula, but also you want to have a floor where you want to make sure you don't have an open space that's just a little tiny,
Right.
50 square feet or something.
Flower bed.
So just have a floor there, have a percentage with a floor with a tiered floor.
So Dan, you're saying that via the method of gross area, say a 10% gross area, that you could have a situation where you would have something smaller than 2,000 square feet on a development that is greater than 10 lots?
No, if it's greater than 10 lots, the smallest you could have is 2,000 square feet.
I know, without the minimum being specified, there's a situation that would occur where with a 10-unit, an 11-unit development, you could have an open space that is less than 2,000 square feet?
So that'd be a 20,000 square foot lot and like PDR 6 or 7 maybe. I mean, it's not very likely. But I think that really comes more into play into the fact that when you have a broad area and developers trying to fit in open space where they can, you want to make sure that it's large enough to be usable. I think as kind of more of an exercise of breaking up the required open space than it is having the total open space be that
It's
number.
the each space, not the total space.
Yeah.
I got it now. Thank you.
So I think we've used up our allotted hour about, so any other comments or guidance, and look forward to continuing having this conversation,
We're going to be revisiting this twice again.
at least.
I think, and I don't know what Dan's thoughts on this are, but I think if you have any other thoughts about how you'd like to work through this, this is a lot of information. There's a lot of details in this. It's pretty meaty information. So I think a couple things I heard were bringing examples and pictures and to get a sense of what we're talking about, what the math looks like on the ground. But I don't know, from your perspective, is it easier to say, let's just work through one of these topics next time? And then the second topic, the meeting after that? Like, I think it would be helpful for both Dan and I to understand your preference on how you want to tackle the next work session around these topics or the next couple work sessions. And then we can schedule that accordingly on your work plan and bring it to you in the way that is easiest for you to work through, because I understand this is a lot and it's quite cumbersome.
The more complex one is probably the density. I would suggest that we concentrate on density next time, and then the following, we can do mop-up on density and concentrate on space.
And I understand the reason for doing this, but if you were to give us examples of, concrete examples of where the rub is for the inconsistency or the lack of clarity for a planner, and show us that so that we can help parse out where we can make it clearer, better.
Sure. And just to give you an idea of, real quickly on that, where we hear about this the most is infill projects of 1 to 2 acres, where, once you get over that partition, get to 4 lots, all of a sudden you have this requirement for a 1/4 acre of open space. That's one of the biggest concerns. And also, people have gotten comfortable with us saying, just use the comp plan density, but then when there's gaps and stuff, there's some questions come up there. So those are the biggest rubs that we've heard from developers. There's also the other thing, which is something that we didn't get into much tonight, but really talking through how on those lots through the city, what is the appropriate lot coverage. We continue to get those, particularly for a lot of these subdivisions that were built in the 90s. What is the appropriate lot coverage? We get requests all the time for sheds and such that, of course, the houses were built to the maximum lot coverage and there's not any potential additional lot coverage. And I'll tell you, the Street of Dreams homes are built to maximum lot coverage for sure. Each of them's really pushed it, but developers didn't too, and so really that's an important point that we'll revisit that I didn't get into much tonight is how, when we look at that table, what should that lot coverage be? And if that lot coverage is different than the plan development approval, how can and how does someone get to that lot coverage for their individual lot?
One additional, I guess, comment I would have is, you talked about these primarily being applicable to infill developments. It would be nice to have the information on how many more infill developments we have in our existing stock, because if we're talking about 2, then maybe it doesn't make sense to go through all this effort of updating the code to address 2 more potential developments. If it's 200, okay, yeah, it makes more sense. Just kind of a cost benefit to make sure that we're
Sure, that makes
focusing our
sense.
attention in the right place.
And there is potential that some of the other like urban reserves, such as, the one west of Willamette Way, when that comes in, that may go to a PDR, or at what stage that, the former Filbert Orchard, when that comes in, what kind of PDR that one ends up with. So those are another 2 areas, as well as the residential land owned by Mentor Graphics along Canyon Creek. Those are a few areas that I think we really need to think about as we're looking at these projects.
Wouldn't we have the option of applying neighborhood to those areas?
Well, they're currently zoned, so, that it'd probably be something that need to be agreed upon by the property owner. All right.
Anything else? Thank you very much. We look forward to this again next month. I think no, not next month. We come up with this in June, maybe.
I think right now it appears on your work schedule that it's sketched in for July, but it might be actually, especially if we're bringing you pieces, we might be able to bring some of this back to you in June.
Yeah, and that's the other thought is probably we do have to break this down just so we can fit it in with the other work session and keep your minds on it and not really have to redo this presentation in a year when you actually have time on your work schedule to do the other chunks. So thank you.
Thank you. And we have one more major item on our agenda, the housing report. Ms. Batchel, would you introduce?
Yes, thank you, Chair Greenfield. Coming forward to present to you this evening, the 2018 City of Wilsonville Annual Housing Report is Charles So, Assistant Planner with the City of Wilsonville. As many of you will recall, we started doing this report in 2014, was the first annual housing report that the City of Wilsonville published. This is our 5th one. It started coming out of a recommendation from the 2013 housing needs analysis that the city conducted. And through that project, we looked at the existing housing stock as well as our residential housing need for the next 20 years. That's one of our requirements through the state planning process. But we also wanted to understand the population growth, the household growth in the city, and where that was headed over the next 20 years and our potential demand and need to provide additional housing. Through that report, it was recommended that we do this annual housing report to really track what our housing development is, the types of housing that we're developing, the rate of growth. One of the areas we were looking at was because the Metro Regional growth forecast assumes a 1.8% population growth increase for the city of Wilsonville. And historically, we had been growing at a faster pace than that. And so there was some recommendation that we continue to track to really understand and be able to report back to Metro so that when they're doing their growth forecast, they have that information to put back into their model. But then also for us to understand what that means for us in terms of our land supply and ongoing planning. So Charlie's going to present the 2018 Wilsonville Annual Housing Report. This has really evolved with Charlie's support on this project. It initially was in a paper format that I'm not a graphic designer. It was okay designed, but wasn't great. And Charlie's introduced us to the online world of being able to provide this report, and it's much more interactive and has a lot of different aspects, and we're able to get a lot more data with it. So I'm excited for him to present this to you this evening and get your input. You'll see some changes even from last year based on some of your discussion. So we look forward to another good discussion with you tonight.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction, Miranda. Again, my name is Charlie Tso. I'm a assistant planner with the city. And so thank you for the opportunity today for me to present the 2018 annual housing report. So, you know, in essence, the 2018 housing report is a snapshot of the city's housing development activity in the year of 2018. And the report discusses changes in our community's housing trends, the affordability of renting or owning a home, and the projected growth and future housing needs of our community. So I think Miranda gave a pretty good background for the housing report. So I'm just going to jump into the meat of the report, the information, the data side of things. So I'm going to be slowly scrolling through the report, and my presentation is going to, the data that I will share will follow the pace. So don't feel like you need to catch every image or every paragraph that's on the screen. I will provide the highlight to you. So in 2018, the city permitted 184 homes, and that includes 128 single-family homes and 56 multifamily homes. And the split between those two categories in 2018 is 70 and 30%. So 70% was single family and 30% was multifamily. But overall, the Wilsonville's housing stock is pretty evenly distributed between single family and multifamily. We have about 49% single family housing and 51% multifamily housing. And in the past 5 years, we have permitted over 1,400 new homes for construction, and we approved residential development plans that have brought over 900 homes into the development pipeline, as shown in this graph in front of you. And at the same time, our population growth has mostly outpaced the construction of new homes. And just last year, the housing units grew at approximately 2%, whereas our population grew at about 4% rate last year. So that graph in front of you is sort of a 10-year look at the rate of population and housing growth in the city. So, so in 2018, the neighborhood in Wilsonville that saw the most housing development was Villebois, which is unsurprising, where 139 housing units were permitted for construction. And following that is Charbonneau, where 35 homes in the Charbonneau Range development were permitted to be built. And so this report also documents the location of each permit that was issued in any given year. So for a quick summary of all the permits that were issued that you could see on the screen, we issued a total of 184 permits. The median lot size is about 3,100 square feet, and the medium home size is about 2,500 square feet. And those numbers are mostly the results of the dominance of Villebois, the type of housing that were produced in the compact, walkable urban environment And we have an average net density of 15 units per acre. That's the result of all the homes that were permitted last year. So in 2018, I'm going to get to it. So the city also approved 6 residential development plans, which together comprise about 235 future homes. 128 of those are coming from Frog Pond, from the Stafford Meadows and Morgan Farm project. But with over 200 homes in the pipeline, we should continue to see a strong level of housing construction in the next few years. So coming up next. So now I'm gonna get into affordability trends. So the cost of owning a home has been increasing the past 5 years. And when we talk about affordability, we typically mean that a household doesn't spend more than 30% of its income on housing. So when we look at the median sale price of a home in Wilsonville in 2018, it was about $447,000 for a typical home. But for a house earning Wilsonville's median income, to be affordable, that household cannot really afford a home that costs more than $335,000. So there is a gap between what the market is selling and what's actually affordable to the typical household. And in terms of the rental market, the rental housing market is also unaffordable to the typical household earning median income in our city. The median rent price in 2018 for multifamily units was about $1,600 a month. Compare that to the cost of renting in 2017, that's a 2% increase. However, the median income for renter households is about $52,000 a year, and that means that that household earning median income can only afford about $1,300 in rent. So any amount more than that is considered unaffordable to them. And so the current median rent price for multifamily housing is actually 23% higher than what's considered affordable. Okay, so looking forward into our growth trend, so comparing Wilsonville with its neighboring jurisdictions, we have been growing at a faster rate in both housing and population. As you can see in the graph, from 2014 to 2017, Wilsonville has grown at a much faster percentage rate in both population and housing. But this also shows that we're doing a better job than our neighboring communities at providing new housing to keep up with the demand. And as Miranda briefly mentioned early before the start of this presentation, that Metro's forecast for us in 2014 was that we will grow at a rate of 1.8% per year. But our annual growth in households and population has really surpassed that rate. And in the past, in the past 5 years, we have our household growth has already accounted for about 38% of the total projected household growth in a 20-year time frame. So that's just in 5 years, we've already used up our 38% of our projected number. And similarly, because we are trying to keep up with that demand, in the past 5 years, we also have consumed 35% of our 20-year buildable land supply for the period of 2014 and 2034. And if we continue at the current pace in both population and housing growth, if we don't bring in more residential land to buildable residential land, we will run out of land to build. And so with that, I just want to end to say that the city will have more demand for housing as we continue to attract more families, workers, and jobs to our community. But looking forward, we will also continue to provide a variety of housing options with anticipated new development in the Frog Pond area and also infill development potential in the town center area. So with that, I will open up for questions.
Charlie, do we have an idea of how our affordability compares to our neighbors? That's an interesting metric that I would like to see in this for future years, just to get a feeling for where we stand with regards to the communities around us.
That's a very good question. We have been tracking affordability within our own community, but that's something that we haven't looked at. We haven't looked at how our neighbors are doing. But I would say that not many jurisdictions in the metro region are even doing what we are doing right now. I think Miranda knows a lot more details, but we are one of the very few communities that actually tracked its housing inventory and affordability trends.
There was a report in the news today in which I don't remember the exact number, something like the most dense, or the most unaffordable, rather, underwater communities in the state are in the mid 30% range. Wilsonville in our metro area is one of the lowest, actually, I think, of all the cities that were represented. I think we were maybe the second from the bottom in the percentage of underwater, or what's the word, rent challenged?
Rent burden?
Rent burdened families. We're better than our neighbors, considerably better than our neighbors, much better than our two neighbors to the immediate north. Pleasantly surprised.
So what I can say is that, to my knowledge, we're the only city in the region right now who's tracking and doing an annual housing report. When we went to create the first housing report, we were looking for examples to try to just see what other people were doing and data points to look at and examples to pull from, and we couldn't find any. And as we present this information and others learn about us doing it, they seem to be surprised and interested in what we're doing, so that's good. From an affordability standpoint, we know that a lot of the region is talking about that. There's actually the Clackamas County Housing Needs Analysis is being conducted right now, and through that, they're looking at all the cities in the county. And so we are starting to see information from them. We've received the first draft of that report to start having an understanding of how we do compare on affordability with our neighbors and the different price points and different area median incomes that can afford those different price points. So we're starting to see that information. We actually have it penciled in for your agenda. We're hoping that we can get someone from the county, someone from their team to come and present that information to you to give you that type of update. It'll be helpful, and it will also feed into the work we're doing on the equitable housing strategic plan that we'll be kicking off and also bringing to you soon. And we have the same consultant team on that, so that data analysis will be consistent, and we'll have a consistent methodology with that information to start being able to share that type of information with you. It's something we can probably, having that through that report and through that plan, integrate into the next housing report. It'll be harder to track some of that information over time if our neighbors aren't tracking it as well. We'd have to try to somehow figure out a way that what data sources would be available to us that if we can't necessarily get those data points consistently from our neighbors. So we'll try to look at that and see what we might be able to track over time with that or not. And then the last thing I would note is on this issue of cost burden households and rent burden households is that when House Bill 4006 passed, there were certain requirements put on local cities if a certain portion of your population was housing cost burdened. And Wilsonville ended up not in the category with many of our neighbors on having to go through and do those things and take those additional actions. That may not continue to be the case. That's something that I think they reassess. I don't remember if it's annually or every couple years to look at who's cost burdened. So at this point, we're not on that list, so we're doing a little bit better. But in terms of the price points and affordability here, but I think it's still, based on the information in this year's housing report, it's something that we definitely need to be paying attention to and continuing to try to address. So.
I believe the article in the Oregonian today was limited to what they were calling extreme or severe cost burden of 50% of family income or more.
So one of the charts that you showed there was very striking, which showed the gap increasing of rental costs with the affordability actually falling in the last 12 months. Do you remember that one? It was the bottom line. It's titled Rental Cost Trend. Yeah, this guy. Go. Okay, so I was thinking of the actual chart underneath, but this is.
Are you thinking figure 16?
Yes.
This one?
Oh, okay, yeah.
So I didn't understand why that line has fallen, because that's kind of a interesting and possibly concerning drop. Does that mean that the people who are living in multifamily housing have less income this year than last year? Is that what I'm reading?
So the affordable rent is calculated based on the median household income for renters, and using that to calculate spending no more than 30% of that median income on monthly rent. I think, I think I'll have to double check the data, but so if the data is trending down, I believe so the data is, one of the caveat is that this income data is coming from the American Community Survey. And so under 2018, that's just the most recent data that's available to us, but that data was actually collected in 2017. So every year there is a lag year. That may be the explanation of why there's discrepancy, that we see the median income seems to be going up, but the affordability level, the amount of rent is falling.
And that is the case on figure 11 as well for the home sale price versus affordable, what a family can afford. So it's not just the rental side, it's all.
Right, and so the home ownership side is a little trickier because the affordability for owning a home not only depends on the household income, which that part has been steadily increasing, but it also depends on the interest rate that we're using every year in calculating that. And so that interest rate fluctuates every year. And I remember this year, the interest rate was higher than what we used last year. So that's also that also explains why it seems like we're having a bigger affordability gap. So on the home ownership side, there are more variables that go into getting that figure.
Big one being equity.
Yes, but yes, also I think yeah, that's correct. Yeah, the homes, they do appreciate every year in their value, which is a good thing if you're a homeowner. But it also means that the barrier to entry is higher for those who are looking to buy.
So you're going to check both of those. The renter, though, looked like it may be an error in the data because the income is going up and the affordability is going down. Those should be one-to-one relationship.
Yeah, that's what I
Yes.
was wondering.
Yes, so I will definitely, I'll look into that data there, and I will follow up with all of you to explain what may have caused that discrepancy there.
So one of the things that I think requires much more in-depth conversation by the commission and probably the council is this business of whether or not we are looking at this affordability question only for Wilsonville. Because affordability is a definitely regional issue, if not kind of West Coast issue even. So if Wilsonville takes this goal of making its housing affordable, it's just going to get, that'll be the only affordable market in the whole metro area, and everybody will want to move here. So that will push your prices up. The market is going to push the prices up just because of demand. One of the graphs that you showed, and this, I've been tracking it, this point I made the last report last year as well, the construction and the population increase. To me, it looks like you build it and they will come. The population increases follow a year after the housing stock increase. So as we build them, the population increases. Again, that becomes an issue that is needing to be looked at regionally because Wilsonville cannot be where all the housing needs are met by building more and more houses because others are not keeping up. I'm used to Metro Councils giving targets for the number of housing units to be built per decade and even year to year for all the municipalities within the metro region based on a regional housing goal. Now, I didn't get a chance to go look at Metro Council's website to see how they're projecting their housing goals. It doesn't look like they are doing that, which again begs the question, if you don't do that, then some municipalities are just going to be left with the burden of housing the growth for the Metro Council while others are sitting on their hands.
Yeah, so yeah, I agree that housing affordability needs to be looked at on a regional level, and we should partner with our regional government and really every jurisdiction in the region to look at what would be a regional level solution. But I would say that affordability, it's a problem in every jurisdiction, every community in the U.S. that is growing and that is growing economically. And if we look at cities like San Francisco, which has probably the #1 affordable city in the United States, San Francisco has restricted a lot of housing construction activities throughout the past few decades, and it's and it didn't stop people from moving to San Francisco because it has a lot of jobs. So I think on the one hand, we need to look at, we can't be the only jurisdiction to only think about this problem. That's definitely correct. But on the other hand, I think we do have a responsibility for our own community to think about not just making housing affordable for newcomers or people who come here for jobs, but people who already live here, people who may be renting right now who want to buy a home, or people whose kids grow up and they want to move back here and, have kids and live with their grandparents. I think that people, because we are a successful community, people will want to move here, and if we don't continue to provide enough homes, what will end up happen is people with more money will be the ones to be able to actually buy a place in our community. And I don't think that's necessarily a desirable outcome either. So I do agree with you. We need to look at this issue also on the regional level, but I think on the local level, that is something we should continue to discuss.
But the point I was making, Charlie, is not that there shouldn't be a balance between job creation and housing creation. Those two locally definitely needs to be balanced. In other words, if we are creating new jobs, we should also see what the housing demand for those jobs are and create those jobs. But the issue of growth needs to be in a much more or better framed context. Because yes, people want to move to where they want to move. And if you keep housing them, you're going to end up with LA. And it's going to start eroding the quality of life. So at some point, there needs to be a balance in the kinds of decisions that we make, in how fast we grow, in the context of the quality of the community that you're having. And these questions keep coming up, usually in the context of, we don't want to be Portland. And I'm not thinking about it in those terms. What I'm thinking about is quality of life, and whether or not the quality of life is getting undermined when we have this embrace all growth as they come because the market is demanding it perspective. And I look at some other communities that are saying, we're much more pickier. Now, of course, the result of that is usually gentrification. So these are all things that are floating around, and we are trying to balance them, and they're all counteracting one another. And it makes it almost impossible to strike that perfect balance. But I don't want to create these false dichotomies that say, oh, if we do this, then that happens, and that's all we are thinking about. There's 200 other things that are happening as well at the same time.
Yes, and I would say that I think on the quality of life issue and you're concerned about we can't just keep absorbing more land and keep pushing out. I would say that there are opportunities for us to actually address that. One example is the town center plan that is carrying it, that is approaching to its final stage. It will actually, it's going to provide a lot of infill development opportunities to provide the type of housing that, actually both the younger generations and the aging, more elderly citizens of our community are both looking for. That is compact and walkable type of housing that's close to urban amenities. So I definitely share your concern, and I would just want to make a plug for one of our ongoing projects. That is an example that will help us address that concern.
Thank you for pitching that. The other point I wanted to make, which you brought up this balance between multifamily and single family. And you said these kind of basically half and half. The PowerPoint language was saying well-balanced. And I take issue with that because there was no data provided in your presentation that to me says we have a proper balance between single family and multifamily. In most jurisdictions, there is an oversupply of single family houses when they get down to brass tacks and evaluating the data. I'm not seeing the data here. And maybe it's premature. I brought this up in the past. Miranda has said we don't have a long enough kind of number of years of collecting the data to be able to project trends and those kinds of things. I caution against using that language because in time, data may come that says, no, we really overbuilt one or the other of these categories, and we need to correct that. And if we have 5, 6 years of saying, oh, we're well balanced, then we have a harder work in correcting the impression.
Yeah, so I agree with you on your concern. And actually, like when I was looking at the data, I was thinking, well, 50-50, but is that really the right split that meets our housing needs? I would say that, so what's considered well balanced or not is, I guess to your point, isn't, at least from the policy objective point of view, isn't very well defined at this moment. But I will say that, and Miranda, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, the state does have a requirement for jurisdictions that when they plan for residential development, they need to keep at least a planned capacity for 50% multifamily and the other half for single family when they're planning for their residential capacity.
It's part of the statewide housing rule, which is that we're supposed to be planning for 50-50, 50% multifamily and 50% single family.
Is that to prevent prejudice against multifamily? Is that the policy point, or did they do an analysis that showed the demographic requirements coming up are such that it requires 50% multifamily?
So I wasn't in the room when that policy was set or part of the policy discussion with the policymakers, but my sense from it and having kind of worked in land use in the state for a while is that it was more of a policy decision around wanting to support both single family and multifamily and to be providing both types of housing equally and providing an equal ground footing. My sense is not that it was based on a rigorous statistical analysis about our demographic growth and the housing types that would be demanded based on that.
Or market analysis?
Yeah.
It was a sticking point back when Frog Pond was being brought into the urban growth boundary by Metro. I do recall that. And at that point, actually, we had an excess of multifamily that was of some concern. And now we've actually come much more to equality.
See, that's the problem I have with just pulling 50-50 out of the air because people are saying all single family in some municipalities, and the state is trying to force at least a fairness in that mix. I understand that that could be the case, but I would have liked to see them saying, unless you can show that your analysis is saying we need 60% multifamily because of the demographic and market analysis that we've done. I suppose that to lawmakers opens the door for all kinds of statistical lying. As a planner, I have more faith in our ability to look at the demands for the housing in a particular community and the surrounding area and saying we should be providing for what the community really needs as an asset, as opposed to just randomly going 50-50.
Yeah, and I agree. I think as from the state requirement point of view, I guess we are well balanced. But to your point, that is, how do we really know if a particular segment of our population is needing a particular type of housing, right? We don't have that information, and so we cannot necessarily say that from that point of view that our housing is necessarily well balanced. I would say that that is one of the limitations of the housing report. That is the purpose of the housing report is to track inventory and build and sort of on the supply side activity. But your concern is valid, and I think it is something that perhaps the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan can take a deeper look, especially with I believe the plan is more data and statistical, sort of analytically focused. So I think there is opportunity to answer that question in the next project.
What is that process going to be?
Yeah, so without stealing Kim Rybold's thunder, because she will be coming to you in the next couple months to outline the scope of work and the timeline for the Equitable Housing Strategic Plan. But the main components of that are, one, to do a market analysis. So taking what we're finding from the Clackamas County Housing Needs Analysis and building on that, very specific to Wilsonville, to have a better sense of not just our supply, but also the demand and the market and the different price points, and get a sense of where the gaps are in our housing inventory in the different price ranges. I can, and so that's the first deliverable. The second other pieces we'll be doing some public engagement and trying to get an understanding of some people's experiences with housing and obtaining housing in the community. And then there is, we'll be looking at different policies and programs that the city could adopt or implement to try to address the gaps that we've identified. And so those will be, we'll be kind of looking at the first list will be more of a laundry list with some general kind of information about them, so we can start to look at, okay, which of those match up with what we're hearing and what we're seeing in the data, and are things that seem to be more applicable to Wilsonville and more palatable for Wilsonville that we would be interested in adopting. At the end of that project, it's an equitable housing strategic plan, so it is a plan, but that would have, the goal of that plan, the outcome of that is to have 6 action items, so 6 things that we would then pursue as policies or programs as a city to try to address the gaps that we identified at the beginning of the project. So I need to check it. We're outlining the schedule more clearly now between the project teams, between the consultant team and ourselves, but that should be coming to you within the next couple of months.
Really happy to hear that, because the housing study is not an end in itself. You know, we don't navel gaze just as a practice. It's the first step towards getting to what you're talking about. It's supposed to be driving our comp plan.
Well, it's very complex. There are lots of components to take account of, to balance, to juggle at the same time. There's certainly the market is a big piece of it. There's, I think, a social justice issue, which is hard to deal with in city planning, but nonetheless is out there. And there should be, I think, an aspirational issue with regard to the community's concept of itself, and what we want it to be. We could certainly put up 4 or 5 story buildings all over our territory, and they would fill up with apartments. If we built them, they will come. So the aspirational part of that is, the aspirational part is a break on that process. There are some things we could do that we don't want to do. And there are other things that we could do and we should do. So this process needs to take a multi-pronged look, or that's a bad metaphor, look at this in a whole range of ways, taking account of a lot of variables. And values must not be lost.
Thank you.
So, one small thing, would you go to the top, the figure 2? It's new homes permitted for construction. Yeah. Now just scroll up a little bit so the picture goes away.
Oh, down here?
The other up. Keep going. There, stop.
Oh, here.
Okay,
You
scroll
just
down.
want the picture?
I want the photograph.
Oh,
Oh,
I think you might want to change this
yes.
photograph.
Thank you.
yes,
Thank you.
certainly.
Yeah,
I
appreciate that,
It
yeah.
stood out to me and I thought,
Yeah.
oh gosh.
yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
What is the issue?
Well, look at the left side of the picture.
Yeah?
This is the
Oh,
building.
is that the one that
This is the
burned
building
down?
that burnt.
Apologies for that. We reviewed this 2 weeks ago when we put it in your packet.
So what is the issue about, well, so it were.
As an illustration in our report, this is a little incendiary, shall we say.
Yes.
That's not for the minutes.
No, but just broadcast, so.
People are tweeting that right now on the internet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm really out of line to suggest any kind of flippancy about this very grave situation.
So I think the last thing we'd want to note for you probably on this is that we can provide you with the link. I believe the new version went live today, or is
Well,
going
went live,
soon?
we didn't do like a public
Well,
push,
right,
but
but
you
it's
could
the new
access it
link.
on the city's
Okay.
website.
And there, it is interactive, so I encourage you all to look at it. Many of when you saw the different permit dots and the different house icons, you can click on those and get additional information about the permits and the approved housing plans as well.
It's a very impressive website. My only problem with it is these things sliding too quickly up and down the pages. They can be stopped, but you need to be careful with the mouse.
Yeah, you scroll at your own pace. It's the way of the future, I guess.
So while this picture is up, more to the point that we were discussing, I heard on some of the coverage in the news and so forth, a critique of the fact that the density is causing fire hazards and so forth. But then I heard the issue here was that the sprinkler system wasn't in place because it's under construction. Has that been addressed? Or is it something that eventually the Planning Commission is going to be talking about, whether or not some of the issues that we deal with, like densities and like the middle density stuff that we were talking about in the town center, is potentially going to require a different set of standards for safety that we may need to catch up with, or something like that. Is there going to be some discussion of any of that?
I don't think we can talk about any of that until the investigation is complete.
Well,
But at that
Of course,
time, you know, we will definitely be
okay.
looking at to the extent
Right.
there's something that we need to look
So
at.
to the point, I guess I was following this up to the point that Chair Greenfield mentioned, that we're not taking this flippantly. When I was hearing the news coverage, I was wondering when and how it was going to be looked at by the Planning Commission, because it would be appropriate.
Depending on the results of the investigation.
Yes,
I don't, I hesitate even to respond, but it seems to me that this is not a code issue at all, and therefore not really within our purview. But I think that if there are safety factors that can be engaged, that this is probably something that our council needs to be addressing.
At this point, I would just like to say, I don't think it's appropriate for us to talk about the hypotheticals because the investigation is still underway.
all righty.
But I do want to say that I don't think that it is a planning issue.
Any other questions for Charlie on the housing report?
Thank you, Charlie.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for your feedback, and really, your critique and comments are what will refine the report every year, so I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, then, city council action minutes have been distributed, and there were many actions, most of them in consent agenda form. Are there any questions or concerns to be relayed back to council?
Just a quick question, Miranda, and that's, we end up with almost like these legal descriptions inside the plan. Was the stuff that just recently was included for in city limits, is that the Frog Pond stuff? Didn't I see that inside the city council?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure,
Yeah.
because it's, you get this kind of legal description rather
Yes.
than, hey, it's Frog Pond.
Yeah,
Okay.
yep,
So it's the working out of decisions that have been made, essentially.
yeah.
I think the lawyers have a lot to answer for.
Yeah, well, we do.
Then our work program, the schedule looks like it's very sparse, but in fact, we have a lot coming up.
You do. I mean, I think that the projects that are going to be coming in front of you are pretty meaty, and you're going to have a lot to talk about those. And then, as I mentioned last time, we are awaiting the city council retreat, which is happening next week. And with that, we'll get a new set of council goals for the 2019 to 2021 timeframe. And so we're not wanting to move too many projects too quickly until we have better information on that. We are moving a few other code projects, and we are meeting with a project team tomorrow, and so we'll have a better sense on when we're going to be bringing those back to you as well. So hopefully next month, what you'll see is a number of other items filled in to that schedule. Right now, you don't have anything on your May meeting, so we will keep you posted on that. If we have items that are coming forward, we will hold a meeting, but you might actually get a month off. I don't think we've actually done that in about 2 years. So you may get the gift of some time, but we'll keep you posted. And then you'll have plenty of work to do after that, I promise.
So the list of projects are underneath the table. Those are likely, but depending on council goals, really.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of those, actually, I'm looking at least 3 of those have been adopted or been recommended for adoption. I'm working on a number of the projects that aren't led by planning. I've reached out to those project managers just to better understand when to plug those into your calendar for updates or work session items. So I'm hoping that this calendar gets much more populated with their projects as well, not just the planning division's projects.
Anything else for the good of the order? Then I guess we are adjourned. Great.
Thank you.
The gavel went down at 8:03.